afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jeannie Allen, and I am the founder and CEO of the Center for Education Reform. And I'm super excited that you have taken time out of your busy schedules to join us today. This is Charter Schools, an opportunity for permissionless education. I'm going to give you a little background before I introduce our participants. We are here for a couple of reasons. And in the Q&A, hopefully you'll share with us why you're here. First and foremost, this is our CER's effort to help pay tribute to the 30th anniversary of charter schooling in America. Charter schools are born in Minnesota, as hopefully everyone out there, in fact, in the world should know by now. In 1990 was the law, and 1991 was the first school. And so over the next year, the folks at the Founders Library at the National Charter Schools Institute, run by Jim Gunner and managed by Ember Rice-Strunga, the state legislator who brought charter schools to Minnesota, are bringing stories about how it started and what we need to know to people throughout the country. So we decided to pick November as our month. And as we thought about the theme we wanted to bring to you all, we said, you know what, why don't we talk about one of the issues near and dear to our hearts, which is innovation. Because opportunity is great, the opportunity to choose schools that best meet your kids' needs, the opportunity for teachers to thrive, the opportunity for them to be flexible, administrators to support great education. But without innovation, opportunity can also be hollow. So here's what we're going to do, and then I'll ask Ted to come back on. I'm going to introduce the fantastic Ted Kolderie, a dear friend, a pioneer in the fight for great and equitable education for everybody. Ted Kolderie and I probably met close to 1991, Ted, I would imagine, if we can bring Ted back on now. Hi, Ted. And Ted Kolderie was the scholar, the author, the thought leader who really put kind of the ideas of chartering that had been inherited by Ray Budde and other people to work and gave it a presence. And if you don't know Ted Kolderie, if you haven't read his work out there, I'm going to do some commercials right now. You cannot possibly claim to be as interested or engaged in chartering as you may be if you don't know the whole story. So this is our part of the story, and you can learn more through us, but I always think you should go to the original source. So Ted is the co-founder, senior fellow at Education Evolving in Minnesota. He's been involved with the design and advocacy of innovations in public education since the early 90s, initially with chartering as the R&D strategy for systemic change. He's got tons of awards, things he's authored. He started as a reporter and editorial writer, and graduated from Carleton and the School of Public Affairs at Princeton University. So Ted, I want to start with the beginning of our conversation. We're going to talk for a few minutes, and then we're going to bring in our innovators from the other states. But you know, when I first began to talk to you about what it was that we should talk about, you said to me, you know, I said, what if we talk about innovation? And you said to me that that innovation really was not telling people what to do, but letting people try new things that you don't have to ask permission for. So let's level set and help people understand first what's meant by innovation.
Sure, Jeannie, I think you've said it exactly right. If you have a permission-based system, the person giving permission is responsible for your success, and that doesn't work for either them or you. There are three things to say quickly about it, which I think are maybe not well understood and should be understood around the country. The first is simply that the charter laws did not create any schools. The schools were created by teachers, parents, and other organizations. And the laws were open as to the kind of school that any organizer could propose to the authorizer. Which this means that a charter school, contrary to a lot of the impression that's around, is really not a kind of school in any pedagogical or organizational sense. There are all kinds of them. Christine Jacks, who was commissioner here for a while, said once, you've seen one charter school, you've seen one charter school. You have to look inside to find out what they have their students reading, seeing, hearing, and doing. And we've had both kinds. We have in Minnesota and across the country schools that are trying to do conventional school better, which is good. And we've had schools that are trying to innovate, which is good. It is okay to do both. The second thing I'd like to point out, I think it's important to have understood, is that the result of this has been to make what used to be called school reform possible within public education around the country. Forever, there were people who had great ideas about how to make school better, how to make education better. But for years, as Larry Cuban used to point out, school changed reform more than reform changed school. So the only way for that to have worked would have been for existing district schools to change, or for districts to be willing to create experimental schools. They're very different from what they were running, and neither of those things was going to happen. Most of this innovation as a result drifted off to the private sector. So what chartering did was to create a space within public education in which it was possible to try things. It's just really that simple. It was, as you said earlier, an R&D sector. And here certainly, and I think generally the idea is for things to be tried, innovations to prove out here, and then be picked up gradually by the district sector, which is also beginning to happen. The third thing I'd say, and the last thing, is that chartering really has worked for innovation. You know, this varies by state. It depends on what the law is and the way it's been implemented in a particular state, but it has been to a significant degree an R&D sector. This is certainly true in Minnesota, where the motto of the State Association of Charter Schools is liberating education from convention. You can go on their site and see that, and Gene Piccolo operates it that way. This is helped also by the fact that Minnesota has unusually, I think still uniquely in the country, the concept of the single purpose authorizer, a newly created nonprofit that has nothing else to do except to concentrate on soliciting or receiving applications and approving and starting schools. And so
Ted, let me just jump in real quick, because I want to stay on something you just said about particularly coming off of the comment about the mission statement of the Minnesota Charter Group. There's a lot of people out there. I want to just start, dispel a myth. There's a lot of people out there that think that when we say innovation, well, the charter schools were supposed to be a laboratory, and if it's an innovation, then it should be proven to work for everyone, and then it should be immediately shared or returned somehow, that the onus is on the charter then to bring it back to the system, and that the system and the charter should somehow start sharing and all get along in the world. A, is that realistic? B, was it supposed to be a laboratory and experiment? I mean, I guess a lot of people think innovation. So Facebook, was that supposed to be an experiment, or whatever they're going to call it now? Was it supposed to be an experiment? We did Uber. Is that now a part of life? So can you help kind of dispel this notion? You can tell where I'm coming from, ladies and gentlemen, that I don't believe it's a laboratory, but try to help us understand why do people think that, or why do they want to think that?
Well, replication is okay. You can have something that's...
Oh, hold on. Ted, we can't hear you. Just went on mute. You unmute yourself. Can you say something? Okay, he
I didn't,
froze.
I
Oh, there you
didn't
go.
touch
Got
anything.
it. All right, go
Um,
ahead. You just froze.
What I just said is that replication is fine. You can have something that's known elsewhere, but is new here. And it's good to do that. Um, but you can also have things that are inventions, essentially, that have not ever been done anywhere. And if you keep the scale of the experiment small, if you watch it closely, and if you were willing to close it down, if it manifestly isn't working, that's fine. You can learn from failures as well as from successes. And given the level of failure in the operating system, the scale, the seriousness of a failure in a small experiment sort of pales by comparison, is the way I would present it. That help? Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I think it does. And in terms of sort of scaling those innovations and that notion, how do you think the chartering sector, before we kind of go into the practice of a few examples with the rest of our guests, how did the chartering sector for you and in your sense overtake the notion of sort of state system versus innovation? In other words, why was chartering so critical to make innovation happen?
Well, I think it's what I said earlier, Jeannie. It's you had to have a space where it was legally possible to try things. The charter sector, the chartering laws, by setting up this process and leaving it open for organizers to propose whatever and try whatever they wanted, organizationally or pedagogically, gave us this R&D sector. And so there, as I was, as I said, it has been working. I could mention, three, I think, major kind of things we've seen here. One of them is increasingly personalized learning, getting away from what Ted Sizer used to call batch processing. We have schools that are personalized in the sense of being project-based, where the school asks the student, what's your passion? What are you really interested in? And we'll build a curriculum for you around that. And they'll do these projects over and over again. Sometimes they're individualized. Each student has his or her own project. Sometimes, as in recording, high school for recording arts, which is one of the outstanding ones here. It's more the whole community of students is involved in doing something that really connects with their interests, their culture, their background, that's engaging and motivating and so forth for them. We've had an organizational innovation that broke away from the standard boss worker arrangement, this kind of pyramid in school, and flipped the pyramid so that the teachers really have full control of the professional issues in the school. And this turns out to work in practice, even though it doesn't really work in theory for anybody.
Great examples.
Yeah, and then the post-secondary option, which is something the legislature did separately, but which the charter sector uses quite a lot, which permits young people, juniors and seniors, to in effect overlap the last 2 years of high school and the first 2 years of college and finish both in 6 years rather than 8. All these are, real departures from the standard default model of school, public or private.
Well, let's dig into that a little bit more. I want to bring on Matt Wunder, who is the CEO, superintendent, and founder of DaVinci Schools based in LA. Matt defines innovation as responsive problem solving. And it's created, speaking of project-based and personalized learning, it's created a slew of really interesting variations in learning for students. So Matt, welcome to the couch. if you will, in the webinar today. Ted, I'm going to ask you to, we'll reflect on some of what's discussed in a few minutes, but Matt, let me just jump in and ask you to, coming off of some of this notion of where chartering actually, how it birthed innovation, what did it allow you to do? You're from California. We have Scott coming on a bit from Indiana, Nina from Georgia. Very different laws, as we said, very different constructs. But initially, at least, when it was working great in California, what did the chartering concept allow you to do that you would not have normally been able to do if you had been in a different kind of construct?
Yeah, thank you, Jeannie. So when we got started, I think the ed code was a lot smaller than it is now. We also were in a place where the governor knocked down a lot of the previous governor knocked down a lot of anti-charter legislation. But we, as Ted talked about, we really took to heart that we were the research and development arm as charter schools of public education. And by virtue of not being replicators, we have several different models. And the reason we came up with the models is sort of goes back to Wiggins and McTeague, who said, the purpose of education is to teach in school what you need to know when you get out of school. And as a parent of a 20-year-old, the focus is I want my kid to have a happy, successful life, to be off my payroll eventually, and live the life that he wishes. And likewise, we wanted our students at DaVinci to be able to do the same. And we serve kids from 122 different zip codes. And the message is come as you are, and not one size fits all. And that is sometimes hard to reconcile unless you're thinking about what problems do you wish to solve. So that starts with what are we trying to accomplish? And we believe that industry executives, corporations, they can give us a lot of insight as to what those employable skill sets, what career immersive learning really looks like. So we lean into them. Now, we've been able to do this because we are in a unique relationship with our charter authorizer, Wiseburn Unified School District. We actually serve as their home high school. So even though they could start a new school for themselves, they have essentially sort of given us the responsibility to do so. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. We're just unaware of anyone else who actually does that.
That's a governance innovation, if you will.
It is. And to talk about some of the challenges. So we had 2 elected Wiseburn officials, trustees, sitting on our nonprofit independent board. So there's transparency, there's clarity, they're in our closed sessions. I look at how does innovation get enabled? And I think there's a continuum. There's sort of ask for forgiveness, sort of permissionless education. There's, don't wound the lion, kill it or leave it alone. But I think the thing that has worked best for us and has not worked well when we haven't employed it well is that, I don't know who said it, change occurs best at the speed of trust. So we actually have done very few things that haven't required us to think in 2 different buckets of innovation. One is how do we serve kids and families well? And the other is, how do you jimmy rig a system that never anticipated innovations, that's not built on innovations, that has, cartels that keep innovation from flourishing at times? And I think the way is not poking people in the eye, but working with people and being empathetic and trying to help solve their problems as well as ours for our kids.
But I imagine that you were up against a huge challenge just with sort of culture and mentality about what education should be initially. One of your innovations, there's a lot of them, and I want you to just kind of briefly run through your school names and what they do, but one of them was competency-based education mastery. A lot of people now know what that is. By the way, I don't think most parents and school board officials do. It sounds okay. Oh yeah, we have competency-based. We make sure kids actually know what they're doing before we give them a B. No, you didn't get it. It's not about the B, right? It's about knowing something. So you were able to do that, but that must have been a little bit of a push-pull with teachers, community people, even students, right? The notion that I can all of a sudden take at a DaVinci school, a course in high school that counts towards post-secondary. That wasn't, like Ted said, post-secondary enrollment options was similar to what you're doing. How was that? And I'm sure a lot of people are like saying, oh, Jeannie, what are you talking about? Those aren't innovations. Those are happening everywhere. But they weren't when you started, right?
Yeah. I think one of the biggest challenges is sort of explaining who we are and what we do in a few minutes, right? And when you're innovating, things change. And there's an acceptance of, one of our partners that talks about fail forward fast. And that's a cultural mindset, right? Like you can't hurt kids, but you can make mistakes, and that's okay. In fact, we encourage students to do that, and we encourage all staff to do that. And traditional systems, big systems that move more like aircraft carriers than jet skis, want everything at least to sound perfectly baked and thought through and bulletproof from any mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's an assumption that you're going to spend and it's going to stay the same for a long time, but all schools that are actually trying to be responsive are constantly iterating. And the quicker you can admit your mistakes and move forward, I think the better chance you have of moving quickly and responding to student needs. I do think it's much easier to build a brand new house than to remodel one. And when you're attracting people who have a similar mindset, as opposed to changing people's minds. So even within our organization 14 years later, people are, I think we're hardwired to some degree not to want to have radical change and disrupt how it's going to affect the adults, even though you can see that it might help kids.
Very cool. All right, Matt, I'm going to ask you to kind of move over next to Ted, and I'm going to bring on the amazing Nina Gilbert. Nina is the director of the Center for Excellence in Education and the chair of the Education Department at Morehouse College, a private historically Black liberal arts college for men. And she's responsible for developing all the innovative educational programming in the College of Education, which is also sort of a misnomer, Nina. But Nina's also the founder of the Ivy Leaf schools, Ivy Prep in Georgia. And her background, both now as sort of an innovator in post-secondary, is very informed by her original work in Atlanta. So Nina, we were talking about innovation in the prep call, and you were talking about kind of the innovations you were doing before anybody was thinking about them and the challenges there. So I'd love you to talk about kind of that and kind of moving into the area of higher ed and preparing teachers, and how those things all kind of can connect for innovative learning.
Sure. So thank you, Jeannie, for having me. And I'm thrilled, move my camera, thrilled to be a part of this panel. So yeah, when I think about innovation as a traditional educator in the traditional public school system, for me, starting a charter school was about finding a way to solve problems, and really thorny problems that I experience with my students and my families, in maybe sometimes simple and sometimes complex ways. So there were problems in the local district with discipline issues, a disproportionate number of African American children being expelled and suspended from school. Academic achievement rates were lower among Black and Brown children, although this is traditionally known as a very high performing school district, a Broad winning district. However, achievement levels were not equitable among all demographic groups. So thinking about ways to solve this problem in a more simple way is like, why not create an environment where there's more time for teaching and learning? So we had an extended day. Can we create environments that are conducive for teaching and learning, and students feel safe and nurtured? So that was about creating the appropriate instructional culture, the emotional and social well-being, and culture where students had a positive sense of belonging and well-being. So that seems simple to do. On the more complex end of the spectrum, we had to figure out how to do all of that with only a fraction of the funding, right? And so this notion of doing more with less became a priority, and finding ways to integrate other pedagogical approaches into our kind of instructional model was of the utmost importance. And so using this personalized learning model as an option was very successful for the students who were enrolled at the time, but no one else was doing that.
How did it work though? Explain what your definition then was. And this is in 2000, early?
2013,
okay,
maybe.
Okay, all right.
2013. So it was not without, bumps and hiccups and issues. There are many challenges, but it did require us to do a lot of research and looking at best practices and partnering with organizations and entities that have, mastered this. I was definitely not the expert in online or virtual or remote learning, but we found those people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it was unfamiliar for some of our families, of course, for some of our teachers, but our students were very nimble. They caught on and it worked for them. And we had a much smaller class size at that point, but we were able to share, where our students were able to take courses that I would have never been able to offer as a school leader, especially for high school students. We just did not have the number of students enrolled to support a high school program, right? And so for students who wanted to take AP Calculus and AP Latin, and we had students who took AP Forensics, we could not offer that as a small charter school, but they were able to do that with this online model. It was blended, 3 classes in person and 3 to 4 classes online.
While they were in person at the school, they could do online.
Yes, they could do that online.
Or anywhere.
It was much like a college atmosphere. They had learning dens, learning coaches. It was personalized in a way that it empowered them and strengthened them and prepared them when they went off to college and had to have independent and personalized learning experiences there. And of course, now, almost 10 years later, we found out that everybody is in a personalized setting. including us right now, right? So we're doing everything in
A
virtual.
lot of people are, yeah. So, and there are answer 2 questions for me, if you wouldn't mind. So first of all, there was pushback you got from
Absolutely.
people about it. So I want to hear about that. And then how does that translate to growing the next generation of innovators at an esteemed institution like Morehouse?
Sure. So the pushback was really around the lack of familiarity. And coming from a long line of educators in my own family, they did not understand why my own daughter did not have like books. And why is she, like, what is she doing? And when does she finish? And so there was this notion around never finishing, when actually it was personalized. Students were able to choose when they completed an assignment. So that was unfamiliar and uncomfortable for people. They were accustomed to completing assignments, or even teachers submitting grades, seeing progress, rather than seeing students kind of master a sense of autonomy. And explaining that, while it was still a new concept to me, was also a personal challenge, because of course, I had to present with a sense of leadership confidence, that this is going to work, right? This is going to work. We've committed to this. This is the path that we're on. And then there were teachers that had hired, and some of my leaders pushed back because they said, this is not who we are. This is our model, and our model is static. We don't change it. And so I found that the folks who were a part of our school environment were not as innovative and entrepreneurial as I once thought they were. And I do think what that taught me is that people have to trust, whoever is leading the change in the moment, trust themselves to be able to catch on, and be willing to do that. Yeah, so, looking back.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say, your other innovation also was single sex education was kind of born for the public sector, was largely born out of chartering also.
Well, for me, I didn't know that, right? I didn't know that single sex education was a thing. After I started to conduct research, I saw that it was very common in elite private schools. I attended a middle school, which at that time was called a junior high school, that was all girls, but it was a public school in a small Georgia town.
Mm-hmm.
Boys went to the boys junior high school, girls went to all girls junior high school. So for me, that's on the more simple end of the innovation spectrum, as I thought about it as a architect of my plan for the school, because the thought was, we need to eliminate the social distractions that commonly get in the way of students achieving once they reach middle school.
Right.
And what was that main distraction in middle school? Boys. So we said, we can fix that, right? We can eliminate having this attention of our scholars focused on boys. Now, they tended to put their attention in other places. So, but we did not have that constant competition for the attention and focus of the opposite gender in that gender academy.
Great. Thank you. Do you want to just say a quick word about Morehouse?
Oh, can I say a quick word? I'm so excited about this work because I know, although I no longer lead my charter school and I don't work in K-12, I have the honor and the privilege and the blessing. I feel blessed to be able to help develop this next generation of innovators. So we have a number of students who are considering traditional routes into public education. And then we have other students who are looking to build their own innovative school environments for students who need them the most. So we're really excited about that work. We're also developing a teacher certification program, which will be the first ever. And then we have students who are very eager to pursue careers in education advocacy and policy, so they can make sure that we continue to strengthen laws that will allow this innovation to sustain itself.
It's fantastic. All right, we're going to move you over, bring on Scott right now. Thank you so much, Nina. So last but not least, our final charter innovator is Scott Bess, Purdue Polytechnic High Schools, which were started 5 years ago by Purdue University to help an increasing number of underrepresented students from Indiana gain entry to the university. Heavy focus on science and tech and all good things, and has done a lot of prototyping and iterating and design thinking around education and how it should work. So Scott, welcome. Thanks for joining the conversation. Talk to us a little bit about your experience based on what you're hearing.
Yeah, Gina, thank you. And again, I'll reiterate what Nina said. Honored to be here and part of this. And it's amazing. It's been 30 years. Yeah, I think when you look at our beginnings, and I know that Ted brought up the design thinking. Matt talked about the fail forward. Like those are all essential components of what we do. Because you go back to the mission that we have, right? Which was the charge was, look, we have an abysmal number in the state of Indiana, which I think is also true nationwide, of underrepresented minority students who are qualified to get into tier 1 research universities. And the idea is that it's not that there's a lack of capacity with students, it's just a lack of preparation. And our charge then said, look, if we're going to change the outcome, this is where the innovation comes in, right? If you're going to change an outcome of something, you have to fundamentally look at every aspect of, in our case, high school. Like, what are we doing? And I love the idea of, like, you are preparing students for what comes next, regardless of what that might be. And it's clear that what the outcomes we were getting over the last few decades were not working, right? So we're not getting what we want. So let's stop doing those things. And, the things that Nina talked about, like, so mixing online and in person, we said that we have to get rid of things like a master schedule, that scheduling a student for 36 weeks and saying this is what you're going to be doing every single period in the year makes no sense, because students move at different paces. They have different needs as they go. So we started with that mission. We essentially blew up the high school model, and again, we've been failing forward rapidly ever since then. Just the idea that you've got to make changes, you've got to adapt what you're doing, but you also then have to stay true to the mission, because there is a pull always to go back to what was safe, right? What people know. Like, if you want people to know math and you're struggling a little bit with doing it through projects and everything else, the pull is, well, let's just have math class. But then you say, well, actually, I know what those outcomes are, because we have data for years and years and years that show low-income kids, Black and brown kids, if you just stick them in a math class, it's 45 minutes a day, you know what that outcome is. So let's don't do that. Now, maybe we need to change what we are doing, but let's don't go back. So that really is the mission. It's been a blast to be able to kind of take a big swing at, our tagline is reinventing high school. And it's, by the way, there's a reason not a lot of people have done it, because it turns out that it's really, really hard. But if you don't try, you just know what you're going to get. So that's been the fun part of the last 5 years.
Well, I think it's really interesting because, Matt started out by talking about Ted started out by talking about how you shouldn't have to, like, the idea of iterating and innovating shouldn't depend upon permission. Matt mentioned the rules and regs that have slowly increased into California. Nina mentioned funding, one of the restrictions and the problems in Georgia's law. Indiana's got a pretty strong charter school law. So if you go from California through the country to Georgia and stop in the middle, you've got one of the best.
Yep.
So has that had, and when we say that, why don't you describe how it's been permissible for you, why you've been able to do what you've done pretty quickly, right?
Yeah, very quickly. It seems like a blink of an eye, really, the past 5 years. So I think in Indiana, what they did well, really from the very beginning, was they set up a charter law that was designed to encourage innovation, designed to encourage these things, but with really strong accountability. So you saw some states where it was put 1,000 seeds and see what blooms, and some of them were going to fail. In Indiana, it was high levels of accountability, but also high levels of freedom, right? And if you combine those two together, you get what I think we have here, which is a really, really strong charter sector. In Indianapolis specifically, we have mayor's office that has done a terrific job from the very beginning of authorizing schools. It's one of the only mayors in the country that has that ability. But then we've also seen things like Indianapolis Public Schools, which is the largest district in the state, has entered into these innovation schools and portfolios where they're actually partnering with charter schools to improve the outcomes within their school, right? And that's not common, but it happens because there is this foundation that says, look, you can have these schools, you have these freedoms, and now people can start to take advantage of it. And I think that's it's not unique to the state, but it really is the bedrock of what's made all this possible.
And do you find that people in Indiana, or where you go elsewhere to talk about what you've done, you're a prize winner, a lot of competitions, do they know what the difference is between what you're doing and what a high school down the street is doing?
Yeah, we have a lot of visitors, and we encourage that because we think that's the way we can start to influence everywhere, right? When we think of education reform, we tend to think of it not just as what type of school you are, but what's actually happening in the classroom. And we want to spread that as far and wide as possible. But yeah, it takes a while for people, and I know Matt talked about with the DaVinci schools, and I'm really familiar with, particularly with Rise. I mean, they're doing amazing things, and it takes people a while to put their arms around, like, wait, how can that be high school? And the same is true for us. They walk in and they see students working on projects, and it's may not have anything to do with a core academic subject, but it's part of our overall competencies that we want people to be really well versed in and proficient at when they leave us. So I always tell visitors, I have no idea what we're going to see when we walk through the building,
Right.
But everything is designed to make that student successful when they leave us.
That's great. Well, if I can bring back Nina and Matt for sort of our round robin discussion. Ted, you've been listening to the conversation. I'm sure you've got a lot of thoughts about it. What strikes you from what you've heard from these three representatives of chartering and their innovations? What do you want to share with us from that initially?
Oh, I think it shows the variety of the approaches, but also the increasingly student-centered effort at learning. Why don't you just go ahead and let them talk with each other, and I think that'll be. I'll join in if you want.
I will do that, but I have one other question for you. What did you imagine when you started out with this, that this is the kind of stuff that would evolve?
Yes, and I think that was kind of borne out. That one of the most important things about chartering. Well, let me say it this way. People were not sure that any schools would be created, the law not having created the schools. And what chartering did was to tap into what had been, I'm sure, a suppressed desire in the American public for something different. And maybe that's what you're looking at as you talk to all the others, Nina and Matt, Scott. I suspect they say that's what they've found. Sure has been true.
It's really interesting. Matt, what do you think?
I think that we are kind of, it is challenging to figure out solutions to some of these problems, but we push ahead nonetheless. Scott mentioned Rise. Rise fits into a bucket called independent study schools or non-classroom based study schools. And they're under attack right now because of, a few bad actors. And, bad actors create laws for all of us. And, but Rise kids can't go to school. for the most part 5 days a week. They're dealing with their own children, they're dealing with siblings, they're dealing with court dates. And so how do you create a hybrid system that doesn't fit in well? But to the question, do we envision this? I think we kind of did when, again, we go back to what problem are we trying to solve? So in this case, we're trying to get kids to launch successfully into adulthood. And sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm just going to push back on one thing. I think what causes laws to be challenged isn't that there's a bunch of rational people out saying, oh, there's a couple of bad actors. Like, we don't close all grocery stores because a couple had rats, right?
Right.
They do it because it's an excuse. All right, let's just be really honest. Right? People are looking for excuse. As Ted likes to say, it upsets the districts that they're losing students to the charter sector. So it upsets because they're paralyzed. So look what happened during COVID. Districts all over the country were literally paralyzed. They were paralyzed by union issues. They were paralyzed by not knowing what to do and not wanting to take the risk. District superintendents who did take risks had their hands slapped. You guys don't get your hand slapped from the chartering world. You get it slapped from externally, right? So does innovation, Nina, give you more power to push back on a system that is a little maniacal?
That's not been my experience, unfortunately.
Okay.
I still have a lot of learning to do 20 years later. I believed that 30 years later that chartering would not, had hoped that chartering would not be such a polarized issue still, right? And so just had this naive belief that we all wanted to do what was best for children, but it still seems to be highly divisive. And regardless of the innovation, there are still more adult issues that need to be resolved, and it takes priority over what's best for kids. There are times that I didn't want to use the word charter. If I said I ran a great school, people got it. But as soon as I said charter school, it caused a problem. And something that was so poignant for me once, talking to a student, we were preparing for one rally, one of many rallies, where we were advocating to keep our doors open. My third grade student said, well, Dr. Gilbert, what are we doing? Why are so many people here? And so we talked about the importance of our school. It was a charter school. She goes, well, I've never been to a charter school before. What is that like? So my students, especially the younger ones, they did not identify their school as a charter school. It was just a great school that was safe. They learned, they loved their teachers. They knew their teachers loved them. We loved their families loved us. But all of the stuff, all of the noise that was external could not be quieted by our high achievement or by the innovation that was happening inside because it was such a political issue.
So Scott, are you surprised that 30 years later on this sort of anniversary year that things are still as full of tension?
I am, just because I've seen, so here in Indianapolis, that tension, I won't say it's gone, but it's just widely accepted, right? There are so many charter schools. And again, when you have a district that's got almost 40% of their students now that are part of these innovation schools and charter schools, you have less noise. We opened a school outside of Indianapolis and there was a lot of noise, right? And it became an issue in the community. And that was a learning for us, like, oh yeah, not every place is like Indianapolis, right? And so I think that's the challenge that we face. You would hope that people would look at, and again, I just keep coming back to outcomes. Like, are you really happy with the outcomes you're getting? Because it's terrible. right? Some of it might be masked by, you have some high achieving kids and, right, you kind of aggregate everything together, it looks fine. But when you disaggregate and you look at it, you go, oh my goodness, right? We just looked in Indiana, if you just look at low income kids across sectors, rural, suburban, urban, the outcomes are almost identical. And yet you have these high performing suburban schools where like everything's great. Well, it is, except for those kids, right? And I think that's where you would want to have, you would hope, I guess if I go back 30 years, I would hope that people had said, let's bring in something that is going to create a difference, a different outcome.
Right.
And it could be a charter school because they, again, to Nina's point, they are all our kids, but the adult issues tend to get in the way, and that just wrecks or stops the momentum, I think.
And before I go to a couple of questions, and I also want to encourage you guys, if you have questions of each other, let me just ask though, is it really just out that, like, if they're happy with outcomes? Or I keep coming back to this, and I could just be wonky, and maybe I think this is the most interesting thing in the world, nobody else does, but you've all touched on things that your schools are doing. I see it elsewhere throughout the country. This connection, you could be starting at K in some cases, or you could be starting at 9, but the connection to career and college, which is an enormously important theme today, that I think that if a parent said, you know what, Scott, I don't really care about your outcomes for somebody else's kids. I love the fact that my children are going to show up there, or at a DaVinci school or college prep or whatever, and actually have access to an individualized mode of learning. Is it maybe that you're bearing the lead? That's the problem?
Yeah, I think that's possible. I think when we look at because most places are only focused on the measures that they quote unquote control, right? So what's our test scores, what's our graduation rate, and don't dare hold me accountable for anything that happens beyond here, right? And we just happen to take a very different view of that says, look, we are responsible for what happens later. So our preparation, turns out, perhaps, as a former math teacher, it kills me, but knowing the quadratic equation may not be the most important indicator to success in life, right? But being prepared in all these other aspects and being a good thinker and being able to fail and learn from it, seek resources, those actually are really, really important to post-secondary and to careers. And so I think changing the narrative, and I think to your point, looking at what outcomes do you want to be responsible for? Well, we want to be responsible for those that beyond high school, that completely changes the narrative. And that is very alarming to most of the traditional school sector, because they look at it and say, well, no, I can control how many kids graduate, and I can control test scores. I can't control that, they break up with their boyfriend and they fail in college. Well, we think you should be able to prepare kids for that outcome.
And to isolate those things.
If I can jump onto what Scott
Please.
said, there's so much brokenness there's brokenness in K-12, but there's brokenness in the financial model, both in higher education, both for students and increasingly for institutions. And if you look at the horrendous outcomes for low-income students completing college, what is it? Depending on whose stats, between 9 and 14%, measured over 6 years. So the problem we tried to solve, and it's been really hard over 14 years, but we're finally in a place where we've blurred the lines between high school and college. So students have an opportunity to get a bachelor's degree and a high school diploma.
Mm-hmm.
But telling that story with, parents are still, and I'm not chiding them, but parents still hold on to, if my kid just gets a bachelor's degree, then there will be this high-paying job just waiting for her, him on the other end.
Mm-hmm.
And that is somewhat a myth.
Mm-hmm.
It's a day gone by. And so I think part of again, where I think DaVinci needs to do a better job of telling the story, and it might be to the broader charter community, is how do you create smaller sound bites that don't dilute what you're actually doing and are real and authentic, that are very, very complex. Because parents just want to understand and students want to understand that.
Right.
Hard to talk about.
And then at the same time, and I'm going to bring in their question here, you're working on how to answer those big questions, how to solve for X. X is student learning, right? In lots of different ways with the same challenges everybody's having. How do you combat the continuing anti-charter forces and themes? Nina, maybe start with you. What are the strategies, the best strategies to overcome the oppositions and the misinformation so that you could continue to grow? And how does that work in your world?
My answer is, it's not scholarly. It might not, resonate with anyone else. I've chosen not to engage in that. I've done that. I've paid the price, personally, professionally. On some occasions, I've been on the wrong side of the argument because I did not have the information I needed to either support or defend a particular point or argument. For me, it was always about kids. And even today, I started my schools I started to work in 2006. And as late as this week, I was in a conversation about how charter schools have disadvantaged children of color. And it's hard for me to kind of reconcile that when my own daughter was a graduate of the school I started. She came in at 10 and left and went on to college, right? And is now in graduate school. But on the flip side of that, so I also want to kind of push back on something you said earlier, Jeannie, about our pushback often does not come from authorizers or the charter community, right? It comes from districts. Like I've had it come from both sides, all angles. Charter community sometimes were also not my allies and supporters. So I have had to just really become agnostic about delivery model and more of a disciple of what works for children. What works for children, whether it's charter or district or home or independent, does it work for children? My 3 children all have terminal degrees. The last one is working on her terminal degree. They've attended charter, Montessori, independent, Christian, public, like whatever worked for that child of mine and my husband's, like that's where we put them. And so I think parents deserve that choice. I also see charters as a delivery model. If I tell people that we need to create a school that does X and people are all in, if I say the best way to deliver this model of instruction is through a charter, it's like, oh, wait a minute, wait, we can't do charters now, right? So I just tend to just do the work and avoid the things that will take away my time, attention, and energy because it's pointless. I don't think the argument
focus, yeah,
anytime.
Last question for all of you, and if you guys want to weigh in on this as we kind of close down. So gentlemen, if you want to answer that as well. And what's the biggest lesson you've learned for one of our questions? Biggest lesson you've learned as a result?
Jump in to the last question. Peter Drucker says, politics is getting what you want and need with the least amount of resistance. Brene Brown says, my job is not to be right, but to get it right. Every time we have sort of made others wrong and created resistance, we spent a lot of time fighting that didn't end up moving the needle for kids. When the adults are fighting, the kids get less.
Jeannie, I'd say that the biggest thing we've learned is that we got to quit talking about the one best way. That's just been a curse on education policy for years. There's going to have to be a split screen concept. There are a lot of people who deeply treasure real school. They're going to want to continue to have real school. That needs to be a valid option for them. They just have to quit suppressing innovative schools for people who do want that. That's what I mean by a split screen strategy.
It's helpful. And you have a book named Split Screen Strategy, which is actually fabulous if anyone's interested out there. Scott, you want to bring us home on both advocacy and lessons learned?
Yeah, no, I think the lesson, Ted is exactly right. I can't agree more that there is no one right way to do it. Like what we're trying to do is say, look, here is a way. We're going to try this. There's probably 1,000 other ways that people can do it, and they should. It's the advocacy comes is you should do it, right? We're spending a lot of time. I'm spending time personally trying to advocate through my role both as a charter leader and I'm on our state board of ed. Like how can we move the needle for all kids? And let's don't just sit and complain about funding and complain about restrictions. Let's do something. And I think that's the advocacy that all of us have to do is point to what's possible and get people to move.
And that's fantastic wrap. And lest anyone is at all confused by, I think, what I just heard, I'll wrap it up by saying there's that it's not one way. The key is, as we said in the beginning of the conversation, to allow the variety of approaches, diversities, and innovation to touch our kids, no matter where they are. And if something is not working, they should be given the opportunity, and innovators and educators should be given the permission or have the permission, permissionless, to do the work. And if you can't do it in a system, then you have to be able to do it somewhere else, and those monies should follow kids. And I think that's one of the big lessons of chartering. 30 years of it, there are, I think I often say, it is literally the most diagnosed, the most studied, the most written about public education reform. It's actually only been 30 years. So that's not bad for something that came about in all of our lifetimes.
It was an institutional innovation.
Yes, absolutely. It's a great point, Ted. Institutional innovation, and then it led to all sorts of ones in teaching and learning. So Ted Kolderie, Nina Gilbert, Matt Wunder, and Scott Bess, thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us. Please tweet at us if you have other questions. Sorry if we didn't get to everything, and hope that you will take time to not just learn more, but to spread the news about what is working for kids.
Thanks for putting it on.
You're welcome, everybody. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.